Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a monumental work of thought, pull it apart, and hopefully reconstruct it so you walk away truly informed.
Hopefully.
Our sources today, they plunge us right into the deep end of 20th century philosophy. We're talking about Gilles Deleuze's difference and repetition.
And this is not light reading, to be clear. But it is, I think, one of the most powerful and, in a way, liberating conceptual toolkits ever created.
We're focusing on the introduction, specifically, which is, it's just so radical. Deleuze performs what feels like intellectual surgery on the very idea of repetition.
That's a great way to put it. And the stakes here aren't just academic. He is challenging what he calls the dogmatic image of thought.
And that's a system of assumptions that's basically structured Western philosophy for, what, 2,000 years?
All the way back to Plato, yeah. This image has fundamentally confused difference with, just simple comparison. And it's confused repetition with sameness.
Right. So our mission today is to cut through that complexity for you, the learner. We want to move beyond the jargon to really grasp the singular, powerful concepts that redefine how we see everything. Systems, history, even our own psychology.
Exactly. We want to get to the bottom of why Deleuze argues that true repetition isn't just doing the same thing twice.
No, it's an absolute act of transgression. That's his word. A transgression against both natural and moral law.
And to get started, we have to internalize this central, very counterintuitive claim. Deleuze sets the stage with a comparison that seems totally innocent. He asks us to consider the phrase, two things as alike as two drops of water.
Which we've all said, it's the go-to example for perfect identity.
And for him, it is the absolute worst possible example of repetition. It's a perfect illustration of everything we need to reject.
Okay, let's unpack that right there.
Yeah.
Because when we say that, we are trying to emphasize absolute sameness, absolute identity. If that's not repetition, what on earth is it?
It's generality. That phrase, that whole way of thinking, belongs entirely to the order of generality, which is, at its core, the principle of substitution and exchange.
Substitution and exchange.
Think about it. If you have two drops of water, you can literally swap them out, and nothing of consequence changes. They are exchangeable particulars. And for Deleuze, that's the opposite of repetition.
So the problem really begins with that confusion.
It's the central problem. Deleuze insists on this really rigorous distinction between generality and repetition, precisely because that dogmatic image of thought has relied for centuries on confusing the two.
And this idea of generality, you said it's an organizing principle. How does it work?
Well, he says it always breaks down into two orders, two ways of organizing the world based on exchange.
Which are?
So first, there's the qualitative order of resemblances. This is your two drops of water. It's where the similarity of appearance dictates that things are exchangeable. They look alike, therefore they are fungible.
Okay, two identical shirts, two identical cars, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And the second is the quantitative order of equivalences. This includes things like mathematical cycles, averages, equalities. Think of a closed mechanical system. If you run the cycle twice, the output is considered equivalent. It's all about the numbers matching up.
I see. So whether we're talking about things looking the same resemblance or two different processes yielding the same numerical result equivalence, we're still in this framework of generality.
You've got it. It expresses a perspective where the replacement of one term by another is basically neutral. It doesn't matter.
The particulars don't matter.
The particulars don't matter. The empiricists weren't entirely wrong when they said general ideas are just particular ideas that can be replaced by any other similar particular idea. Generality operates on the surface, ensuring that the resemblance of properties allows for easy substitution.
But Deleuze is saying that true repetition, the kind he's interested in, is only a necessary and justified conduct in relation to something that cannot be replaced.
It cannot be replaced or substituted. This is the first crucial leap you have to make, moving from the exchangeable particular to the non-exchangeable singularity.
So if you can swap it out, it's generality.
Right. If it's a commodity, it's generality. But if it demands a singular, unique response every single time, even if it looks the same on the surface, now you're approaching repetition. We're looking for something that carries its own power, its own eternity, rather than just waiting for the next similar event to come along.
This brings us to what I found to be the most visceral contrast in the whole introduction, the economic difference. Generality as exchange versus repetition as gift and theft.
It's jarring, isn't it?
It's incredibly jarring. Theft sounds so destructive. How is this singular, non-exchangeable act of repetition supposed to be a gift and a theft at the same time?
Well, it's a brilliant conceptual move because it emphasizes that repetition is fundamentally non-utilitarian. It's non-transactional. Generality, as we said, is the commerce of substitution. It's the economic market where particulars are exchanged for their equivalents. That's exchange.
Okay, that's mundane. It's just a transaction.
It is. But repetition, on the other hand, relates to these non-exchangeable, non-substitutable singularities. Think of a genuine echo, or a reflection in a mirror, a double. These aren't just resemblances. They are bound to the original source in a singular, unsubstitutable way.
Right. The source material is really clear on this. It says you can't exchange your soul or substitute real twins. There's a unique relationship there that just looking alike doesn't capture.
Exactly. And that's where the gift and theft come in. Repetition is a gift because it's an offering of pure singularity that affirms itself beyond the utility of exchange. It's a donation of the self or of an event that just can't be monetized or rationalized within that system of general laws.
And the theft part.
The theft is its aggressive, its transgressive relationship to generality. Repetition literally steals the event out of the cycle of law and exchange.
It yanks it out of the system.
It yanks it out of the system. It affirms the singular moment so powerfully that it violates the expected substitution that's inherent in that general system. So the repetition of the singular is an act of violence against the comfortable, predictable resemblance of the world. It's radical. It's almost ritualistic, demanding a unique investment of faith or action every single time.
That immediately makes me think of the biological distinction he makes later on. We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, but it feels connected.
Yeah.
If the head is the organ of exchange, calculation, language, sameness, then the heart has to be the amorous organ of repetition.
Yes. The site of singular, non-exchangeable passion.
Right.
The mind, the conceptual apparatus, it deals in general symbols and equality. But the heart, the seat of the will and pure passion, it only relates to singular, non-exchangeable objects, whether that's through love or faith or even madness. The move from the head to the heart is the move from the marketplace of exchange to the singularity of the gift.
And this inherent violence, this singularity against substitution, it necessitates a massive philosophical shift. We have to move from representation to genesis. We have to break away from the framework that all of traditional philosophy relies on.
The dogmatic image of thought is completely reliant on law. Generality belongs to the order of laws, whether they're natural, social, or moral. And a law only determines the resemblance and equivalence of its subjects. It forces particulars to change just to illustrate the law.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. If a law states all things fall at X rate, the objects themselves, a leaf, a stone, they all fall differently. They are particular. But they change their state, they fall only to prove the law's generality. And this makes true repetition, the reaffirmation of the original singular event, totally impossible under the law.
So if the old way of thinking is trapped in representation and just reflecting the world through abstract concepts and mediation, Deleuze is demanding that we move to the power of repetition, which operates at a deeper, creative, almost genetic level.
Exactly. It's not about describing the world, it's about generating it anew.
And this genetic power is what lets him define repetition through 5 qualities that are just.
Yeah.
They're so radical, they pit it directly against generality.
And we should nail these down. They are absolutely crucial for understanding everything that follows in this deep dive.
Okay, let's do it. What's the first one?
First, repetition is a transgression against law. It's an act of violation. It's an exception, not just another example.
Okay, number 2.
Second, it's a singularity opposed to the general. It's the individual event affirmed as universal. And third, it's a universality opposed to the particular.
Wait, hold on. How can a universal also be singular? That sounds like a contradiction. Doesn't universal mean applicable everywhere?
It does, but traditional philosophy defines universality as the abstract concept, the universal concept of man or chair. Deleuze's universality belongs to the idea itself, to its genetic power.
Okay, I'm still struggling a bit.
Yeah. Okay, think of it this way. The concept of revolution is general, but the singular fall of the Bastille is the universal of revolution. Because that single event contains the entire power and meaning of all future revolutions, repeating them in advance. It's the singular event as the origin of all movement.
Ah, I see. The singular event, when it's repeated in this true sense, it affirms its own generative power And that's what makes it universal.
Precisely. And the final two qualities just reinforce this. Repetition is an instantaneity opposed to variation. It happens in a flash, not across time. And it's an eternity opposed to permanence. It's not a lasting state, but the return of the singular moment.
So in every single respect, repetition is a transgression. It's putting law into question and affirming what he calls a more profound and more artistic reality.
Yes.
The idea that this profound truth isn't found in mirroring the world, but in actively generating a new dynamic reality. That's the transition we need to track. If law and representation fail, where does Deleuze turn to find this true, vital repetition?
Well, he traces this opposition generality versus true repetition through three major domains. He looks at natural science, moral law, and ultimately art and the unconscious. And this forms our conceptual map for the rest of the discussion.
Okay, let's start with science.
Mhm.
Because science relies on repetition, right? We repeat experiments to verify results. We isolate variables to ensure the phenomena are equal. If generality is about equality, shouldn't science be the one place where repetition finally works?
You'd think so, but it only appears to work because science just substitutes one kind of generality for another.
How so?
Well, scientific experimentation begins in nature, where everything is constantly changing. It's this vast cycle of resemblance. To conduct an experiment, scientists have to establish a relatively closed environment, a lab defined by chosen factors. So they substitute the natural order of resemblance with the mathematical order of equality.
They control for temperature, pressure, time, all of that.
Right. And so the repetition that appears is purely hypothetical. It relies on that fragile formula. Given the same circumstances, then the outcome will be the same.
And that's its weakness.
That is its fundamental weakness. It's an artificial setup. True repetition, Deleuze would argue, is categorical. It's principle. It is carrying a single time to the nth power without needing a second or a third time. It's the intrinsic power of the first event, not the equality of the subsequent appearances.
And this leads us to what he calls the Stoic error. Why do the Stoics, or really anyone who believes in a fixed natural order, fail to grasp true repetition?
The Stoic belief system often held that nature operates according to these permanent cyclical laws. The idea was that if the universe were completely reconstructed, the exact same events would repeat in a perfect sequence.
Great year and all that.
Exactly. But Deleuze argues this is a complete illusion. The law of nature, far from guaranteeing repetition, actually condemns its subjects to change.
Because the law is just an empty form of difference. It compels its subjects to illustrate the law, but at the cost of their own transformation.
You've got it. I mean, consider two scales of time. On a human scale, a mountain seems permanent, right? It's a constant. But on a geological scale, that same mountain is a variable. It flows, it erodes, it changes its composition.
So the law of gravity might be constant, but the subjects that illustrate it are always changing.
Always. From a falling leaf to an entire tectonic plate, they are constantly transforming themselves and their environment. Perseveration is not repetition. Just staying the same is not the same as the singular power repeating itself. Nature's law excludes true, non-exchangeable repetition.
So if we see repetition in nature, he's saying it's either a miracle or the expression of some superior dynamic power that's affirming itself against the uniformity of nature.
Yes, exactly. The moment we isolate the phenomenon and call it a law, we're focusing on the abstract equality of the concept, not on the singular dynamic event that produced it.
Okay, so natural law fails to deliver. So philosophers then turn to moral law.
They do. The moral sphere tries to sanctify this idea of reiteration, but it does so through duty. This is Kant's highest test. To be moral, your conduct must be repeatable without contradiction. It must be capable of being legislated as a universal law for everyone.
So the moral person uses the law to try to defeat the wearisome, changing nature of daily life. They try to impose a perfect, repeatable form on their own actions.
But this attempt at moral repetition just immediately falls back into the same trap. It becomes the generality of habit.
We turn virtue into routine.
We do, and think of that quote from Buchner's Danton's Death, which Deleuze uses to show this profound boredom. He says, "It is so wearisome. First you put on your shirt, then your trousers. Always you put one foot in front of the other. It's all very boring and very, very sad."
That quote just perfectly captures the sheer tedium of routine when it's divorced from any singular meaning. It's the ritual of sameness.
And that sameness, that second nature we call habit, relies entirely on resemblance and equivalence. Conscience applies the moral law, which just restores the image of natural law, a variable conformity of action with a given model. Moral habit can never give rise to true repetition because it's inherently substitutable.
How so?
Well, if I fail to follow a moral duty today, someone else can perform that duty, and they illustrate the general law just as well. The particular actor is completely exchangeable.
So true repetition has to oppose moral law just as much as it opposes natural law. And this is achieved through what he calls the spiritual twins of philosophical method, irony and humor.
They are the twin transgressions against the law. Irony is the ascent, it's moving up toward principles. It challenges the law as being secondary or borrowed. It denounces it as a second-hand principle that diverts original, singular power.
I like the book of Job.
Exactly like Job, where Job infinitely contests the second-hand, generalized explanations that his friends offer for his unique suffering. He demands a direct relationship with the source of power, not a mediated law.
So irony seeks the absolute principle behind the law. What about humor?
Humor is the descent. It moves down toward the consequences. It involves submitting too perfectly to the letter of the law, precisely in order to evade its spirit. It's a strategy of hypersubmission that mocks the law by fulfilling it beyond all necessity.
And in doing so, it reveals the law's arbitrary nature and finds singularity within that submission itself.
Yes. This is the famous example of Abraham submitting to the law to sacrifice Isaac. He's adhering to the rule, but he transforms the action into a profound exception.
So the unity here is that repetition belongs to both irony and humor. It's always an exception or a transgression.
Always. It reveals existence recommencing and reiterating itself, but only once the general constraints of law have been violated or overcome. It's the emergence of the universality of the singular in action.
So if law in all its forms fails, then true repetition has to be expressed through dynamic action, not static concepts. And this is where Deleuze brings together two unlikely allies: Kierkegaard, the philosopher of faith, and Nietzsche, the philosopher of unbelief.
And he unites them precisely because they both oppose repetition to generality and move philosophy onto a stage. They create a theater of the future.
And they are united in their common target, Hegel.
Absolutely. Deleuze denounces Hegel for proposing an abstract movement of concepts and mediation. He calls it a false theater. For Deleuze, Hegel substitutes the real movement of the singular to the universal idea for the sterile relationship of a particular to the general concept.
So Hegel is just reflecting the world. He's not creating it.
That's the ultimate philosophical slam, yes. Hegel is stuck in representation, while Kierkegaard and Nietzsche want to dramatize the ideas themselves. They want to produce movement that's capable of affecting the mind outside of all representation.
And to do that, you need a new language of movement, right? A language of direct signs that can bypass all the mediations of logic.
Yes, you have to invent vibrations, rotations, whirlings, gravitations, dances, or leaps which directly touch the mind. It's this insistence that metaphysics must be physical. It has to be in action.
And the distinction between these two great philosophical dramatists is in the type of movement they champion. Kierkegaard's movement is leaping, while Nietzsche's is dancing.
That's right. Kierkegaard's leaping is a spiritual movement of faith. It's a jump beyond all aesthetic repetition, beyond despair. It's a singular act of infinite resignation that finds God in the exception.
And Nietzsche's dancing.
Nietzsche's dancing is movement as physis, as nature itself. It's the willing itself through the eternal return, selecting and destroying, affirming difference through the cycle.
And Nietzsche's Zarathustra seems to be the highest expression of this philosophical theater. It's conceived entirely for the stage, scored and visualized.
It's the scenario for the eternal return. Nietzsche uses these superimposed masks, the mask of the core, the young woman, over the mask of the repugnant old man, to fill the inner emptiness of the mask and inscribe absolute difference within the repetition of the eternal return.
So the repetition of the cycle isn't the return of the same things.
No, it's the return of difference as the power that determines the things. The core idea here is that repetition is this terrible power of pure forces and dynamic lines acting without any intermediary upon the spirit. The stage is where the mind is directly affected, without the interference of a representational concept. This is real movement.
And that leads us to the final and maybe most abstract movement, the internal engine of repetition itself.
Right. Here, Deleuze moves from theater and ethics into the depths of human thought. He has to distinguish repetition from both habit and memory. Repetition, he says, is the thought of the future. It's opposed to the memory-based categories of, reminiscence in Plato and habitus, the modern habit of acquiring habits.
And critically, for this true repetition to even occur, forgetting has to become a positive power.
A positive power that gives rise to a superior, active unconscious, the eternity of the instant.
Now, the common understanding of repetition, especially in psychology, is negative. We repeat because we repress the past, or because we fail to remember it properly. Deleuze says this is totally inadequate.
He does. He analyzes 3 case studies, 3 conceptual blockages, where identity or sameness is invoked to account for repetition, but still fails to grasp the difference in the repetition.
We should probably detail these blockages.
No.
They seem to define the limits of that old dogmatic image.
Absolutely. The first is discrete extension, which applies to nominal concepts. Think of Epicurean atoms or even individual words. They have finite comprehension, which means you can fully define them.
Okay.
When they are forced into existence, hic et nunc, here and now, they multiply into identical individuals, doubles, twins.
I'm struggling a bit with the difference between resemblance and this idea of repetition in existence when we're talking about twins. Can you walk me through that again?
Of course. Resemblance is an external judgment we make. We say these 2 people look similar. Repetition in existence is an internal genetic fact. These individuals are absolutely identical in respect of their concept. They are a population of sameness that's been forced into being.
So the repetition exists because the concept itself is limited and has been instantiated multiple times.
Exactly. It's not just 2 similar particulars. It's the concept repeating itself materially without any internal difference.
Got it. It's a kind of natural blockage where the concept can't generate anything new, so it just replicates the same finite individual.
You've got it. The second case is the alienated out-of-memory concepts. These are the concepts of nature. These concepts have indefinite comprehension, but they lack memory. So nature repeats because it is partes extra parts outside of parts and mens momentania, a momentary mind.
If nature is partes extra parts, does that mean if I shatter a mirror, each individual piece is a new, absolute instance because the original has no memory of the whole?
That's a fantastic analogy. Nature doesn't collect its moments. It repeats itself identically because it immediately forgets what came before. So novelty is then shunted solely to the human mind that observes and represents nature.
And the third case, the Freudian psychological one.
The repressed unconscious, or concepts of freedom. Here, the idea of freedom remains unconscious, while memories and representations are repressed. So the repetition appears as a constraint or a compulsion. It's a repetition of the object that's enacted instead of being known.
The knowledge is blocked from consciousness, which leads to the behavioral enactment of the trauma.
Right. And in all 3 blockages, the discrete, the alienated, and the repressed repetition is explained negatively. It happens because of not comprehending or not remembering or not being conscious.
But this is where Freud provides the major turning point, isn't it? This is what moves Deleuze beyond that negative explanation.
Yes. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud introduced the death instinct, or thanatos. Freud realized that repetition in trauma often violated the pleasure principle. People were repeatedly putting themselves back into painful situations. He concluded that repetition can't be explained just by amnesia or repression.
So thanatos becomes the positive, originary, transcendental principle for repetition. Why transcendental? Does that just mean it's super important, or is he using that word precisely to define the very conditions of our experience?
It's the latter. Transcendental here means it sets the conditions for the possibility of repetition itself. Thanatos is silent, it's primordial, it is the domain and meaning of repetition. The pleasure principle is noisy and psychological. Thanatos is the deeper foundational force. It is the affirmative power that drives both creation and destruction.
This completely flips the common understanding of trauma on its head. The usual idea is we repeat because we repress, but Deleuze flips it. We repress because we can live certain things only in the mode of repetition.
That's the core truth. Repression is just the mechanism we use to preserve the ability to repeat the original experience, enacted in its pure, non-conceptual form.
So repetition is inherently symbolic? It constitutes itself only by disguising itself?
It does. The variations, the displacements, the masks, they are not secondary compromises or failures. They are the internal genetic elements of repetition itself. The bare material repetition, the observable obsessive ceremony, that's just the external envelope. That's the repetition of the same, appearing only as a cover for a more profound, disguised repetition of difference that's being played out by Thanatos.
So the mask doesn't hide a truth beneath it, it just hides other masks. The truth is the process of infinite disguising and the unfolding of difference. Repetition is ultimately difference without a concept.
That's it. You've got it.
Okay, that dense analysis gives us the key terms we need to approach Deleuze with some confidence. Let's make sure the learner has the definitive glossary of these radically redefined concepts.
Absolutely. And it's vital to see these as functional tools, not just static definitions.
Let's start with the big one, generality. What's its function and what's the trap?
Okay, so term, generality, the function. It expresses a point of view where one term can be exchanged or substituted for another. It relies on qualitative resemblance and quantitative equivalence, the trap. The trap is identifying it with repetition and thus confusing the functional generality of the particular with the profound universality of the singular. And the quote, "If exchange is the criterion of generality, theft and gift are those of repetition."
Perfect. Next, the central concept itself, repetition, true.
Term, repetition, true. The function. This is a singular, non-exchangeable power and conduct that affirms itself against law. It carries the single, unique time to the nth power. It's the interior, disguised essence or the spirit of repetition, the trap. Assuming it's just an aesthetic recurrence, a perfect equivalence, or, the boring process of doing the same thing twice. And, quote, repetition expresses at once a singularity opposed to the general, an instantaneity opposed to variation.
Okay, let's clarify that idea of simulated sameness, the one that results from a conceptual failure. Discrete extension.
Right. Term. Discrete extension. The function. A type of conceptual blockage where a concept with finite comprehension is forced into existence hic et nunc, here and now. This creates a population of absolutely identical individuals like doubles or twins, the trap. Assuming this phenomenon results from a simple logical blockage or that the identical objects possess infinite comprehension. Quote, this phenomenon of discrete extension implies a natural blockage of the concept. It forms a true repetition in existence rather than an order of resemblance in thought.
The distinction between the outward appearance and the inward reality is crucial. Let's define the surface effect. Repetition of the same. Bare.
Yes. Term. Repetition of the same. Bare. The function. This is the mechanical abstract effect. It's the symmetrical outward appearance, the external envelope of repetition. It's often called cadence repetition. It's the observable form. The trap. Mistaking this bare material repetition like an obsessional ritual for the truth, rather than seeing it as a cover for the deeper disguised repetition of difference. The, quote, a bare material repetition of the same appears only in the sense that another repetition is disguised within it.
And its internal driving opposite, dynamic repetition.
Term. Dynamic repetition, the function. The form of repetition where difference is internal to the idea. It unfolds as pure movement, creative of space and time, and it's grounded in intensive values, inequality, and dissymmetry. This is rhythm repetition, the trap. Confusing it with static arithmetic repetition, which is merely its abstract symmetrical envelope or effect. Quote, in the dynamic order, there is no representative concept, nor any figure represented in a pre-existing space. There is an idea and a pure dynamism which creates a corresponding space.
And finally, the transcendental anchor for all of this movement and difference. Thanatos, the death instinct.
Term. Thanatos, death instinct. The function. This is the positive, originary, transcendental principle that gives repetition its power and meaning. It is the supreme affirming force that compels repetition and provides its autonomous disguising power, the trap. Explaining repetition negatively, for example, as the result of repression or amnesia, rather than seeing thanatos as the force that requires the blockage of representation in order to affirm the original singular event. And quote, strangely, the death instinct serves as a positive, originary principle for repetition. This is its domain and its meaning.
Okay, this theory becomes undeniable when Deleuze uses art and history to demonstrate this reversal of causality. Let's look at the example of Charles Péguy and the French Revolution. Conventionally, we think the later event commemorates the first one.
That's the static, chronological view of history and remembrance. It belongs entirely to generality. Deleuze, through Péguy, just completely reverses this, he says. It is not Saturation Day, the subsequent celebration, which commemorates or represents the fall of the Bastille, but the fall of the Bastille, the original singular event, which celebrates and repeats in advance all the Federation days.
Wait, hold on. You're saying the original event reaches forward in time to repeat the future instances. That sounds completely contradictory to how we typically perceive linear time.
Well, this is the idea of the nth power. Repetition is not adding a second or a third time to the first. It is carrying the first singular time to its ultimate universal power. The singularity of the source, the Bastille falling, already contains the dynamic power of all future instances of revolutionary action.
So the Bastille event isn't an isolated particular, but a universal singular. It provides the internal genetic movement for every instance that follows, and that's why Monet's first water lily repeats all the others.
Exactly. The first one contains the artistic intensity, the singular idea that the subsequent canvases then just unfold as variation in difference. The power resides in the origin, not in the copies.
The singular event interiorizes and reverses time. Generality flows from the past to the present, from the event to the copy.
But repetition reverses that flow. It affirms the power of the origin in the present moment, making every instance an instantaneous, eternal return of the idea.
So if true repetition is about this dynamic power and generative difference, not sameness, what does this look like in, say, complex systems or artistic creation today?
It looks like dissymmetry and instability. The analysis of the decorative motif is a perfect example. We might think repetition means just juxtaposing identical figures, cadence repetition, arithmetic symmetry.
Just copy-paste, basically.
Right, but Deleuze shows that artists proceed via dynamic repetition. They combine elements of one instance with another. They introduce disequilibrium, instability, and dissymmetry.
This reminds me of complex natural patterns, like a fractal or even music. You don't get generative complexity from simple mirroring.
Not at all. Levi-Strauss observed that in these complex motifs, the elements interlock through dislocation, through productive gaps, and the pattern only achieves stability at the end. The generative force is the instability itself.
And that leads to this incredibly powerful structural insight. The cause has less symmetry than the effect. The vital, positive procedure dynamic repetition is rhythm repetition.
And rhythm repetition is based on intensive values, irrational ratios, polyrhythm. It is asymmetrical and creative. It establishes distinctive points that command intensity. Static repetition, the cadence repetition that's arithmetic and based on equal intervals, is merely the abstract external effect, the symmetry we perceive after the creative work is done.
So when we analyze systems, we shouldn't be looking for sameness. We should be looking for the generative forces that rely on internal difference and instability.
That is the essence of difference without a concept in the real world.
We've covered some profoundly counterintuitive ground. Let's revisit 3 core ideas that really demand more thought, starting with that biological metaphor we touched on earlier. Wait, you mean the heart is the amorous organ of repetition, and the head is only the organ of exchange? Why does Deleuze make this biological distinction between exchange, head, and repetition, heart, so central?
Because it symbolizes the entire move from generality to singularity. The head, the rational organ, it deals with language, science, and calculation, all of which are dominated by the symbol of equality and substitution. When we calculate, we exchange variables for numbers. It's transactional.
But repetition, as a conduct, it requires relating to something singular, a unique object of passion, whether that's love, faith, or obsessive dedication.
Yes, exactly. Repetition requires a spiritual investment, something non-exchangeable. The heart is where the singular object is affirmed, where we commit to the nth power of that unique instant. Exchange is transactional and substitutable. Passion is singular and demanding. Deleuze's philosophy is trying to locate the forces of creation not in the cold logic of the head, but in the singular, affirmative investment of the heart.
That makes repetition sound like an act of devotion, or even madness. It requires us to confront systems of power. Which brings us to the idea of transgression. Deleuze argues that true repetition isn't just against the law, it works underneath laws. Why does this mean repetition is fundamentally more artistic and more profound than our conventional understanding of reality?
It's more profound because it accesses a reality that is generative, not merely reflective. Laws operate on the surface of the world. They deal with resemblances and equivalences. But the power that affirms itself underneath the laws, in the depths of the earth, in the heart, in the unconscious, that's where singularities emerge before they are constrained by general concepts.
So if the law dictates what can be represented, repetition dictates what must be created.
Precisely. It reveals a dynamism that creates its own corresponding space and time, rather than just illustrating a pre-existing geometry. That creative force is what makes it artistic. The artist, the religious man like Kierkegaard, and the philosopher, the eternal return like Nietzsche, they all operate in the sphere of profound, transgressive singularity.
And finally, the most difficult concept psychologically, the one that flips Freud on his head, The idea that we don't repeat because we repress, but rather we repress because we can live certain things only in the mode of repetition. This completely flips the common understanding of trauma and memory. What does this mean for how we understand healing and self-discovery?
Well, this is a radical rereading of the death instinct. We usually see repression as a failure, a block in memory that forces a negative behavioral loop. Deleuze sees repression as an enabling mechanism. It blocks representation knowledge, memory, so that the original highly singular traumatic experience can be preserved and played out in the mode of pure repetition, of enactment.
So repetition isn't the symptom of a failure to remember. It's a positive power that actually requires forgetting in order to execute its mission.
Yes. The repetition compulsion, thanatos, is the drive to experience the event in its pure, non-conceptual form, stripped of the conceptual categories of the head. The healing process, even in psychoanalysis, isn't simple memory retrieval, it's transference, the theatrical operation where the whole disturbance is repeated in privileged artificial conditions. The cure is a voyage to the bottom of repetition, where we authenticate the roles and select the masks. Repetition is the sickness, but it is also the cure, affirming the difference in the event until recognition can finally occur.
That was an intense and expansive journey. We've successfully distinguished between generality, the comfortable world of exchange, resemblance, and law, and the deep, vital essence of repetition, which is an affirmation of difference and singularity.
We mapped how this transgression plays out across science, morality, theater, and of course, the unconscious.
The essential conceptual tool you should carry forward from this is the understanding that repetition is not identity or sameness. It is, as you said, the difference without a concept.
It's the non-mediated absolute difference that is inscribed in the universal singular, driving creation from below the surface of law.
So this deep dive gives you the conceptual language to stop looking for resemblance and static symmetry when you analyze complex systems or art or human psychology. Instead, you can now look for the singular power beneath the laws, the asymmetrical generative force, the nth power of the origin.
And that leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to consider. If repetition is fundamentally about singularity and transgression, a power which creates movement outside of representation, what is the one wearisome aspect of your daily life, that Danton-like routine of putting on your shirt and trousers, that if repeated in the Deleuzian sense, not as habit or duty, but as an absolute, singular, affirmative leap of freedom, would become an expression of pure creation?